top, because the new AI still seems a little bit incomplete. The new deathmatch bots work with hostage maps, but they flood the console with error messages whenever they're searching for a bomb site that obviously doesn't exist. Valve, please fix. Due to their limitations, if he is to ever use the newer, more experimental AI at all, then it's likely to be reserved for the map's alternative, less official versions, like the Dusk and Night ones. Yes, while the original insertion came in day and night modes, insertion 2 goes one better by also featuring a Dusk edition, and you can see how they all compare in these shots just here. Insertion 2 is still a work in progress. The fog right now has a problem. For some reason, players are visible well beyond the rest of the environment. And the fog is kind of inconsistent, letting you see further into the distance towards the edges of your screen. But this should all be fixed soon, and then the map can push on to completion. To thank him for his efforts, Bez has got his own graffiti featured on the map, so has everybody else who has helped with the project. You can see Zul just here, who figured out that the reason that the map was crashing at one point was because there were too many chairs. And you'll notice Oskmoz's name occasionally featured around, like on the train station and in this movie poster just here. Follow Oskmoz on Twitter for updates to this map, and for details on his next project. He hopes to dabble with game development in the near future. Find links to Insertion 2 in the description as well. And thank you to Oskmoz and Bez for speaking with me about this map. Only with Beta 4 that the game finally got the Diffuse game mode, and it quickly gained popularity, soon surpassing Hostage's player base and becoming the primary game mode for Counter-Strike. But why? I think there are three reasons. The first is the obvious one, and that's because Diffuse game mode is objectively better than Hostage mode is. With Diffuse, terrorists start on the offensive, and because they can choose to attack two entirely separate spots, there's a good chance of them being able to overpower the CTs on at least one of these. Then, once the bomb has been planted, the situation reverses itself, with the terrorists camping, and suddenly it's down to the remaining CTs to go on the attack. Defending is normally an advantage, but by spreading the CTs out across two potential bomb targets, it flips the situation somewhat and makes Diffuse a more dynamic game mode than Hostage is, where everybody has a chance to attack and defend in a single round. So there's an element of skill to it, but also luck in deciding where should be attacked and where should be defended, meaning the balance of power can change with every round. But with Hostage, the general idea is that CTs must attack a location in the level, and in order to win, must either kill all of the terrorist team or rescue the hostages, which is achieved by then fighting their way back to their spawn point again. Now this is nowhere near as dynamic as Diffuse mode is, because it's always the CTs going on the attack, and the terrorists just need to camp the hostage room, and then failing that, they sneak off to CT spawn and camp that in order to win. You know that feeling of fear you get when you start a match in Office and are put on the CT side? Yeah, that's all you'd have to imagine to know that there's something horribly wrong with this game mode. So it's pretty obvious that the CTs get a raw deal with Hostage mode. All things being equal, it is far easier to play as the terrorists. But changes have been made over the years in a bid to balance it somewhat. Amusingly, until Beta 4 of Counter-Strike, CTs couldn't even win the round by rescuing the hostages. This simply gave them a cash reward, should they also win the round, which was unlikely. And to compound the difficulty was the atrocious hostage pathfinding and manual rescue trigger should, by some miracle, the CTs successfully get the hostages back to their spawn again. With Beta 4, CTs could now win the round by rescuing at least half of the hostages, which was still tough as hell. Beta 5 meant that hostages were instantly rescued the moment they reached the end zone, as opposed to having to be manually triggered by the CTs who were rescuing them. But until Beta 6, terrorists could prevent all this by simply killing all of the hostages, and thus preventing the CTs from being able to win in this way. This was eventually fixed with a kick penalty for killing the hostages, though the game mode has been prone to other exploits since.
Do whatever you want, just don't. I'm sorry, okay.
Counter-Strike Condition Zero was a strange time for Hostage mode. They acted more like real people, which sucks for the CTs trying to rescue them. For a start, terrorists can move them about, which doesn't seem fair at all from a gameplay perspective. Imagine being able to choose your own bomb sites in Diffuse mode, and the moment bullets are fired, the hostages panic.
Oh god!
Giving away their position with a loud scream and then running off, making it a nightmare to try and rescue them. If the CTs are lucky, then they may eventually rescue themselves, but probably not.
Oh, don't hurt me, I'll go back.
And on top of all of this, I recall a time when you could win by rescuing just one of them, simply by killing the rest of them so that at least half of the surviving hostages had, indeed, been saved. So come to think of it, the CTs may get a raw deal with Hostage mode, but I think it's the hostages who get the worst deal of the lot. All of you newer players won't know about this because since 2013, rescuing hostages doesn't involve having them chase you about the level at breakneck speeds, but instead it involves picking them up and carrying them to the safe zone, and only one of these rescues is required for CTs to win that round. And the hostages start more spaced out across the level to make it harder for the terrorists to defend them in the first place. This is a major improvement over older versions of the game mode. And now, since starting on this video, Valve has further shaken up things by adding back the riot shield into hostage mode, currently only for casual matches, and only for the CTs to buy. Clearly, this is another attempt at balancing the game mode further, but I'm unsure whether even this will be enough to balance hostage mode. Insertion 2 might have more luck. This is a hostage map, but with the added twist that CTs and Ts can choose their own spawn locations every round, and the map itself is much larger and more open than we're used to seeing from hostage mode. This might be the sort of thing that hostage mode needs, if it's ever to shake free from its unbalanced roots. So why did players stick with Counter-Strike's betas, if all it had was a super unbalanced version of hostage mode? And I can answer this one with my own personal experience. It was because it was fun at the time to have a game that let you buy your own weapons, or to achieve unusual objectives such as rescuing hostages. It didn't matter how balanced the game was, it was just a novel experience to have a game mode that wasn't just jumping about and shooting at each other in a deathmatch setting. Hostage might have been unbalanced, but it was so new and novel and the players were so inexperienced that it didn't matter in the slightest. It was kind of cool to be sharing a map with hostages, and to lord it over them as the terrorists, or to see them as people in need of rescuing as the CTs. That's how I saw it anyway. These days the game is a victim of familiarity, and now it's just an inconvenience when you can't afford your rifle, armour or a set of grenades, or if the map or game mode is at all unbalanced. But there was a time when it was just fun to be able to play Counter-Strike for playing's sake. When everybody is kind of rubbish at the game, it doesn't matter if maps are one-sided, as long as it feels cool to play on them, and as long as there's still a reasonable chance that you'll get lucky and will outperform how you should be doing, given the circumstances. When so much of every engagement is left down to random chance or down to the unpredictable nature of silver level aim, it doesn't even matter if you're playing Hostage or Defuse, they just taste like two different flavours to a game about buying equipment. I'm going to apologise for the charts you're about to see, but I can't think of a better way to demonstrate my theory. So here I go. I believe that, for every round of Counter-Strike that has ever been played, there are good and bad factors which go into determining which team wins. In an ideal world, the only thing that would matter would be player ability and the decisions they've made during that round, which are the good variables. If this is the case, then this pie chart would be completely yellow. At the other extreme, if a map or game mode is so one-sided that it determines the outcome of every round being played on it, then this pie chart will be completely blue. And this is bad because player ability hasn't had a role to play here. In reality, I think the outcomes of rounds in Counter-Strike are a bit of both. Player ability makes up a bit, and so do the map and game mode biases. In this particular case, it's 50-50 whether a good or bad factor determines the outcome of a round. And I think this balance changes over time as the player base for the game gets better. Now you sort of understand this Frankenstein chart that I've made, let me show you what I think has happened with Counter-Strike over the years. When the game first came out in Beta 1, the maps were heavily one-sided, so that's represented by a big value of 100. Hostage mode is also really one-sided, so that's represented by another big number like 100 as well. However, back in Beta 1, these things didn't play a large role in deciding the outcomes of rounds played, because player ability was so low and inconsistent at the time that it still determined the bulk of round outcomes, which I've represented with a massive value of 1000 here, dwarfing the other variables. But as time went on, the players got more skilled, and their performance every round less variable. So we'll shrink this skill variability from 1000 down to 500, and then maybe 100, and now 50. Look at what's happened. Now the skill of players has improved enough, most round outcomes are now determined by the biases in the maps and the game mode being played, even though these things haven't changed since the game was released. It's just that the player base has outgrown it. If we want round outcomes to be determined by the skill of the player base again, either the game mode or the map biases must be reduced by balancing these blue bits further. But I believe that hostage maps can only get so balanced because of the inherent problems with the game mode itself. Even a perfect hostage map, if played on by consistent enough players, will still have its round outcomes largely dictated by the unbalanced nature of the hostage game mode being played on. And this is where Defuse mode comes in. I believe that Defuse mode by its very nature is a lot more balanced than hostage mode can be. So even if the skill of the players and the quality of the maps remains the same as in hostage mode, because Defuse mode is more balanced than hostage is, player ability on Defuse mode plays a larger part in determining round outcomes, and is thus better, all else being equal. So that's why I think, once the player base got good enough, Defuse mode reigned supreme. It's worth noting that, although Diffuse Mode was first introduced for Beta 4, that the game mode had considerable problems of its own. It didn't even have set bomb site locations until Beta 5. So if Diffuse Mode's superior balance was the reason for its eventual superiority, then that wouldn't have started until Beta 5 at the earliest. Before then, Diffuse Mode's popularity would just have been from the novelty of it being a new game mode. But yeah, as far as maps went, Dust quickly became the most popular map in the game. By today's standards, it isn't a good map. It was actually removed from CSGO in 2017, probably for this reason. But looking at the map list back then, I don't think any of them were going to win awards for balance, and the maps that are still in the game today, like Nuke and Train, have received numerous changes to them to keep them competitively viable. And even then they're not very good. But this is where things get interesting. What if things had been different? Imagine if a map as balanced as Dust 2 had shipped with Beta 4. What if CSGO's current map pool, in its current state, could have been featured in the game at such an early stage? How would this have determined the player base's preferences for Hostage and Diffuse? Unfortunately, there is no way of knowing how things might have been different had Counter-Strike's first beta shipped with Office, or with the Hostage mode in its more balanced current CSGO form. What if a map like Agency had been around back then? Would that have been enough to keep Hostage mode king for a while? How long before the seemingly inevitable jump to Diffuse mode had occurred? I think these days it's gone further still. It isn't enough that Diffuse mode already balances itself rather well. The player base has reached such a high level of general ability that even the tiniest imperfections to the gameplay or the map balance can greatly tip it in one team's favour. So, much like how Diffuse mode won out over Hostage once players got good enough for it to make a difference, I think that this process has continued to occur as the players, the game's balance, and the maps have all zoned in on perfection. These days it doesn't cut it for a map to simply be good, it needs to be excellent. But more than that, it also needs to be familiar, because it's no longer enough to have great aim and sharp reflexes. If you want an advantage over the other team, it all comes down to your mastery of the game mode and of the maps you play on. And it's progressed so far that players are becoming resistant to change. When a game is new and exciting, players crave new content for it, just as an excuse to play it. But not so with CSGO. Sure, we play new content for a while if we get an achievement or a medal for doing so, but then it's straight back to the same old maps again. The game's player base is becoming resistant to change, where it's reached a point where learning a new layout, new timings and new setup throws has become too much hassle to deal with. The idea of playing on a new map against enemies who may already be familiar with it makes my blood run cold. Even the idea of a match on Office is bad enough, and I've likely clocked up hundreds of hours on that map already. It's just that that is no longer enough. Let's see what it takes for a new map to be accepted into the game. From time to time, Valve forces one of their creations onto the game's player base, like remade Vertigo, and this year it's been Ancient. And they give community-made maps a chance from time to time too. Right now, well, when starting on this video it was Grind and Mocha, but they have been replaced with Insertion 2 and Basalt, which just proves the point I'm about to make here. These new maps may be perfectly fine as far as maps go. Maybe one of these will eventually become a permanent addition to the game, but if Anubis can't do that, then I'm not holding out much hope for these either. And if they're just going to be removed again in a few months' time, then what's the point in me wasting my time learning these, when my time would be better spent learning a 100th grenade throw for Dust 2 instead? So this leaves Agency and Cache as the latest community-made maps to be permanently added to the game, and both of these are from 2013. But moving away from Hostage and Diffuse for a moment, Valve has done a lot to try and branch out into other modes too. Game types like Retake, Wingman and Danger Zone serve as clever twists on the familiar Counter-Strike formula, and I think, had they been featured back in the game's beta, they'd have been very popular. They might have remained so, but having arrived so late to the party, it's hard to see these ever matching, let alone surpassing, Diffuse's popularity. They get a niche, then that's about it. What is required to introduce a new game mode to CSGO? What if there was a custom tournament for it, a prize pool, a chance to play against pro players, and cool and fancy new maps for it? Would that be enough? With this game, we're in uncharted territory. Back before Counter-Strike was a thing, it was normal for games to come out, to be played for a while, and then for people to move on to the next one, or a sequel or something. That didn't make the game a failure, it was just assumed that this was going to happen. Back then, the idea of sticking to the same games for years and investing thousands of hours of our lives into them seemed alien to us. And yet now here we are today, where people are still religiously sticking to games like World of Warcraft and Counter-Strike. So in a way, CSGO is an experiment. How many games can claim to still be going 10 years on? How have we reached this point where just 500,000 players playing it at any given moment is a sign of failure? And has CSGO just reached that inevitable point where, if it stays the same, it'll bore us, but if it tries to change too much, then it'll alienate us? Maybe this is just a natural stage that all video games reach, given enough time, enough familiarity, and enough competition. When CSGO came out in 2012, it was a new game with new weapons.
Let's go! Let's go!
These are bots, and yes, they are setting up for a long A rush. Yes, they are throwing setup grenade throws. And yes, they did just fake it and rushed short instead. This is what it's all been leading to, what Bez the Bot Whisperer's vision has been all about, all along. Bots which are actually fun to play with and against. How has he managed this witchcraft? There are many tricks and exploits that he's used to achieve this, but a turning point came with Guardian Game Mode. Because in order to create this mode, Valve was forced to add new bot support and features so that they were actually good enough to be able to play this game mode. Bez has got a load of these new behaviours and has attempted to apply them to a regular game mode instead. While this new AI is a net positive, these new bot behaviours do have a number of limitations that the old AI didn't, which Bez has had to figure out creative fixes for. Things like how they can no longer pick up weapons, and how they no longer know which team they're on. More on that later. At this point, Bez probably knows more about bots than any other person does. He probably knows more than any one Valve employee does, because just like the source engine itself, the AI behind these bots goes back almost 2 decades. In that time, many of the programmers who designed them in the first place have left, and many others have come along, added stuff to them, and broken them in new ways ever since. Bez has essentially collected all of that knowledge, sometimes from updates, other times from leaks, and sometimes from Valve employees directly. And he's put all this knowledge to good use by updating the Valve Dev bot page with what he's learned, and by applying it to what you can see here, so that you too can have fun playing with and against bots, either on your own or with friends. What fascinated me about his bot story were the challenges that he faced and the clever workarounds he devised, along with how he had to mask their weaknesses in silly ways. For instance, bots have their memory wiped at the start of every round. This is done so that they're no longer fixated on an enemy that they saw at long A the round before or anything like that. But it turns out they also have their memory wiped at the end of every round. So when you hear that guy saying, "Counter-terrorists win," every bot on the map will suddenly forget where they are and what they're doing. If this happens and there aren't any enemies left alive, then that's fine. Bez makes it so that the remaining characters will just casually run about inspecting their weapons and stuff. Yep, despite not coding support for many essential bot actions, Valve did take the time to let them inspect their weapons. However, if there is an enemy left somewhere in the level at the end of the round, then this mind wipe presents a problem, because suddenly all bots in the level forget where the enemies may or may not be. So to play it safe, Bez has got them to rush to the nearest hiding spot and to camp there until the next round begins. He tells me that even this is flawed, because while they know where the hiding spots are, they don't know if they're that well hidden. They wouldn't even know if there was an enemy there already, which could lead to some rather dank encounters. Bez has encountered severe limitations when adding even the simplest of features. Like I said previously, Guardian Game Mode bots don't know which team they're on. But Bez has to use this AI for all their other benefits, so he needed to figure out a way of telling bots which side they were on. And he managed this by getting them to detect if they start the round near a T or CT spawn point, and they